Good morning, everybody. I wonder what it is you want most for the people you love. What do you want them to have? What do you want them to become? Do you want them to have success or become happy or be fulfilled? I've been thinking this week about what it is that those who write in the Bible, the leaders and those who have influence in the Bible, want most for the people they have influence over or they care for. What it is that they want for them. And we're going to be thinking about that this morning. I want to read a little bit from one of the Gospels, one of the accounts of the ministry of Jesus. It's Luke chapter 8, and if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to open it. It's Luke chapter 8, and it's reading just verses from 42, the end of 42, towards 48. So this is Luke chapter 8. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him, and a woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Something struck me as I was preparing this week for this, as we think about this question: what do those who lead in the Bible have an influence in the Bible? What they want most for the people they're influencing and leading in love is peace. That passage that we read there finished with Jesus saying to a woman who was healed, "Go in peace." And this theme of peace just flows all the way through the Bible, and it flows all the time in those kind of words that are sort of departing words for the people of God as they're leaving. They would meet and they'd be gone, and they'd say something to each other. There's a word we have for it. It's benediction, which is a Latin word which just means good words. Here's some words we want you to remember, to stick in your head, for you to live by and to not forget. And those words come up again and again in the Bible, and something that has really that I've noticed and taken stock of for really one of the first times is how often these phrases, these good words that they're leaving people with, include the word peace in those. So for example, in Psalm 29 verse 11, it says, "The Lord gives strength to his people. The Lord blesses his people with peace." So they would read this psalm, or they'd sing it, and they'd go out thinking about peace. Probably the most famous or the most well-known of these benedictions is a few verses from early in the Bible in a place called Numbers. In chapter 6, it's Numbers 24 to 26. And there's a blessing there that's given by the very important figure of Aaron, and it became known as the Aaronic blessing. And it finishes, the very end of it finishes with these words: may the Lord turn his face toward you. And the last word, the departing word, as the people met together, and give you peace. Give you peace. Go out and have this peace. We see it in the New Testament as well. Paul, for example, spends a long time writing to a church in Corinth. There's 1 Corinthians and there's 2 Corinthians, and there's loads and loads of verses and passages and ideas in there. And he finishes all of that writing by saying to them, "Finally, brothers and sisters, rejoice, strive for full restoration, encourage one another, be of one mind, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you." Again, in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, he finishes by saying, "May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through." This idea is just replete, is all over the Bible. In the Old Testament, the word is shalom. That's a Hebrew word. And then in the New Testament, it's a Greek word, because most of the New Testament is written in Greek, and it's eirene. And long before the words like well-being and self-care and all of those things were buzzwords in our society, this idea of shalom or eirene or peace was essential to God's people. It was vital to their understanding of what it was to be human. So let's have a little think about what this shalom means, this peace means, because as we're looking in the series of Galatians in chapter 5 in the Bible of the fruit of the Spirit, the third of those that comes up there is peace. That one of the fruit of those who are walking with God, who are living spiritually healthy lives, is peace. So shalom, as it is in the Old Testament, how does it appear, or how do we understand it from what the writers of the Old Testament say? Well, actually, in its most basic form, it means a state of completeness. So you can actually describe a wall as having shalom, okay? So if you're building a wall and it's finished, you can say it's shalom. Now, it kind of expands in all kinds of ways. So, for example, that sort of sense of completeness, Job chapter 5 talks about your tents, where you're tents with your sheep around and you have everything. He says in Job 5:24, you will know your tents are shalom when nothing is missing. You'll know that your household or your farm is complete when there's nothing missing. So there's a sense of completeness in that. David uses it, King David uses it, he addresses his troops and he says to them, he asks after their shalom or their peace, how they're getting on. Now there's a core idea about humanity that undergirds this word peace, and it's the idea, when it's translated into the lives of people, is that we're complex creatures. There's all kinds of influences that come to bear on us. There's all kinds of things that make up who we are. And this sense of shalom is when those are fitting together. This shalom speaks of when we're complete in ourselves, when all of these multiple parts are coming together as they're supposed to. And it's a beautiful idea and a beautiful image that all of the aspects of who we are, our thoughts, our souls, our relationships, our sense of ourselves come together in this completeness. It has multiple other uses. Solomon, for example, when he completes the temple, he's so into it, he talks about it being shalom. Proverbs talks about our relationships being peace and the restoring of relationships. And when that happens, he says, when you reconcile, you bring shalom. Israel's kings, even when they dealt with the other nations around them, their job, according to God's law, was to bring shalom to the nations around. And that shalom wasn't supposed to be just not warring or not fighting. It actually was to be a sense of people, these different nations who are so different, who are often in conflict with each other, was to bring them into a place where they were working well together for mutual benefit. That's what it was to bring shalom. And then, of course, this shalom refers very particularly and very importantly to the relationship people have with God, the relationship we have with our Maker. So Isaiah chapter 26 says, you will keep in perfect peace with him whose mind is steadfast. You'll live in peace with your God. So this peace, or this shalom, or eirene, is the goal of human existence. It's us being restored and made whole, restored to God, restored in ourselves, restored to each other. And it sounds brilliant. I mean, who doesn't want to have this? Who today doesn't want to have this sense of peace, away from our wrestling and our struggle and our unease or our dis-ease? And how is it possible? I want to say a couple of things about how I think, what I think peace is not. First of all, to say peace is not a state of mind. People will seek to be at rest or be at peace in all kinds of ways, and many of them are perfectly good and valuable and worth doing. You might look for moments of peace, physical peace. You might go for back massages or listening to the sound of waves, or you might smoke hash or drink a couple of glasses of wine. Certain elements of yoga seek this out. You go into certain positions and certain ways of stretching, and you get this feeling, this experience of rest. But these momentary experiences don't bring the whole together. They don't have the ability to bring all the parts of who it is to be us, the complexity of the human condition, and bring wholeness to it. Momentary experiences can't restore us. So it's not a state of mind. It's also not, peace is not us taking control of ourselves or taking control of the now. I've been really interested to come across the spiritualist writer who's so popular at the moment. He's called Eckhart Tolle. I've really heard very little about him, but he's come across my path these past few weeks. I was just in Eason's this week. Yeah, I know, back in a shop. I was in Eason's this week and I noticed that he has got 2 books in the top 10 of non-fiction bestsellers. He's been promoted by Oprah and he's well liked. And in his book, The Power of Now, he basically says that our problem is that we don't take control of the now. We're always looking back and we're always looking forward. And I think there's some truth to that. But his cure for that seems to me to fall short. He says in the book, The Power of the Now, he says, in the now, the present moment, problems do not exist. In the now, we discover that we're already complete and perfect. And essentially what he's saying to people is that you've got to take control of the now. But it seems to me that his cure essentially says that you've got to lie to yourself. In the now, we discover that we're already complete and perfect. I don't know in the now if I feel like complete and perfect. In the now, he said, problems don't exist. No, I can live right here, right now, and I can still be worried about money, still be worried about my rent, still be in pain because of a bereavement or a death. I can still be in aggro inside myself, even if I am living in the now. Is the answer for us to have peace, to delude ourselves? No, that doesn't seem to be the answer to the complexity of the human condition either. In Isaiah, he looked forward, in the Old Testament, he looked forward to a day when God would bring someone who would be called the Prince of Peace, the Prince of Shalom. He spoke of a Messiah, somebody God would send, God himself on the earth. And of him, Isaiah said, there will be no end of shalom. There's someone coming who is the Prince of Peace. He's the deliverer of shalom. So when Jesus comes, and those Christians who are understanding or who had been waiting for this Messiah and recognize Jesus as him, speak of him as the one who brings peace. So for example, Paul, who is a Jew, who will have been familiar with, he writes in Romans, who will have been really familiar with this idea of the Prince of Peace coming, he says, we have this peace, this eirene, this shalom with God through the Lord Jesus. Jesus is the one who restores. He's the one who makes us whole. We read, as we just did in Luke chapter 8 there, about this woman who comes to Jesus. And she's somebody who, by the end of her encounter with Jesus, Jesus says, go in peace. She goes from being a woman who is really not at peace at all. We're told that she's been bleeding for 12 years. She has this sickness that has her in pain. But this bleeding sickness doesn't just have her in pain. It actually, in physical pain, it brings all kinds of other terrible things to her. It means that she is rejected by the community because she's seen as unclean or diseased. That means that she's not able to go week to week to the place of worship. So she's cut off from the worshipping community and cut off from God as well. And Jesus is passing through a crowd, and it's very bustly and busy, and there are narrow streets in the city where he was, and all kinds of people are touching her. But he stops and he says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are like, "Geez, what are you talking about? So many people have touched you. How could we know who you're particularly talking about? Who touched you?" And he says, "No. I felt power go out of me." And something happens and this woman is cured. And it's a very curious thing that Jesus says. He says, "Who touched me?" Because Jesus knows who touched him. He knows that this power went out. And you're thinking to yourself, well, why is he doing this? Why does he ask, "Who touched me?" And it says in verse 47 of Luke chapter 8 that this woman says, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, she came trembling at his feet. You see, this woman felt completely unworthy to be at Jesus' feet. And incredibly, Jesus says that he refers to her as daughter. It's the only time in the New Testament where Jesus calls somebody daughter. And essentially, as he responds to her and she says, "It was me who touched you," he's saying, by me healing your sickness, you are being restored. Now, you've got to understand in Luke, when Jesus heals people physically, he's always pointing to being the one who heals the biggest sickness that all of us have. Actually, our physical sicknesses aren't the most important thing that is wrong with us. Our problem is our sin. And when Jesus heals this woman, she gets a taste of the foretaste of heaven, when we're going to be restored with new bodies. She gets a taste of that. But she's restored to God by being called daughter. He's saying, you're part of my family. You're welcome into this place. He's restoring her relationship to God. And in the presence, we're told, of the people, she said why that she had touched him and how she'd been instantly healed. And you wonder to yourself, why does Jesus make this woman have this sort of public confession? And I think it's part of her being made whole or being given peace again. She wants all of these crowds, and there's loads of them. Jesus wants all of these crowds to know that she's been healed, to know that she's clean again, that she can be part of the community, that they can welcome her in, so that she doesn't just slink off, healed, but still with this reputation of these people who say, you're unclean. The word is out. She's been healed. She can be brought back in. She's being restored to her people. He also wants her to know that what's made her well is her faith. How is it that she's restored and has this peace that she's sent away with? Well, it's because she believed and trusted that Jesus is the one who can make her whole. She being made whole in her physical sickness, her being made whole in her relationship with God, and her being restored to the community comes by faith in Jesus. And Jesus says, your faith has made you well. How are we to be restored? By having faith in Jesus. He's the one who brings us peace. He's the one who restores us to our Maker. And I don't want us to miss this, or maybe this is the most vital thing in all of this, is that only peace with God brings us lasting and deep-rooted peace. I've just finished a novel. It's a novel by Christine Dwyer Hickey called Tatty. And it's a very powerful story of a child growing up in a home with, it's fictional, but I think it is based on her own life. Growing up in a home with two alcohol-addicted parents. And it describes in an extraordinary way the pain and the dis-ease and the unpeace, if you like, of living in a house of such tension, where parents are fighting all the time and arguing, and the kids trying to make their way around that and living in pain and terror and fear of all that's going on. You see, when there's tension in relationships, when there's animosity in relationships, there is no peace. And the Bible says that there is tension, there's animosity in our relationship with God. Romans 5 says, while we were God's enemies, Romans 5 is so important when we're learning these things. We were God's enemies. We're far from him. There's tension with us. There isn't peace in our souls because we're far from God. But don't despair, says Paul. Don't despair in that state. While we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son Jesus. We were reconciled to him. We were brought into this restoration. Peace was brought to us. It's possible for us to peace with our Maker. We can be brought into this when we turn to him and we surrender to him. Now I want to say there's a couple of things that might prevent you from experiencing this peace. Now, it's possible that you have anxieties and unease that do need to be dealt with by somebody who's a professional, that there are patterns of your way of thinking that have you in such a state of pain and unease that you should go and speak to somebody, and please do that if you're in that place. But it could be that you just have a general restlessness, general lack of peace, and it comes because you don't recognize, first of all, your need of restoration to God. There's lots of reasons why you might not recognize that need. It might be that you don't believe in God. It might be that you don't like the form of God that's been presented to you. Maybe you believe in God, but you want to keep him at a distance, and you don't feel you've got peace with him. It could well be that you believe there might be a God out there in some way, in some form, but you don't like the idea that this God has the right to say, here's how you should live. It doesn't fit in with what you've learnt from culture about what it is to be a whole person. Because our culture tells us that what it is to be a whole person is to be able to choose who we are, to do what we want. To be free, to be human, is to have our choices, and that we can have our own self-identity. And I wonder if you're somebody who believes that, who maybe doesn't want to surrender to God, accept God's invitation, because you believe that you get to do it yourself. And I suppose the question I have to ask you and those who think like that is, well, is that working out for you? Is that working out for our society? That being able to self-designate, or to be able to say that who I am and who I want to be is what's going to give me peace and happiness. Is that actually happening? Maybe it's possible that the one who created you knows best about how you can be whole, how you can be restored and put back together again. But it's also possible that you do believe in Jesus. You do trust in Jesus as the one who brings peace, and you have come to believe that. but you still aren't living in peace. You know God is the one who brings you peace. You know He's in control. You know living by some other master will bring you dis-ease and not give you peace. And yet you still don't have peace. And I've been feeling that this week, or maybe these past few weeks, a sense of unsettledness, or I don't know. I've been not sleeping well. It's been taking me ages to get to sleep. I thought for a while it was because I confused Diet Coke with Coke Zero and thought that Diet Coke had no caffeine, and I took that and I couldn't sleep that night at all. But then it persisted and happened over a certain number of nights. And I think the reality is, though, of course I believe in Jesus and I surrender to Him, I've been living as if I don't. Living as if I'm the one who's in control. I'm the one who can run things. I'm the one who can bring peace to myself. You see, becoming a Christian and surrendering to Jesus for the first time is not the end of our spiritual lives, but it's the beginning. In Galatians chapter 5, where these fruit of the Spirit are listed, it says that we walk in step with the Spirit. We've got to keep in step with the Spirit. We keep in step with the Spirit by allowing ourselves to be nurtured by what God has to say. We allow ourselves to be changed by the reading of the Bible, by listening to sermons, by meeting with other Christians and praying. And reminding ourselves and being reminded by others that we're not in control. That we can't control our peace, but it's God who gives that to us. I want to say finally, that as we receive peace, and I hope you do, you receive it from Jesus, and He says, "Come to me, and I will give it to you." That we then go out and we live as people of peace. And many of you know that I grew up in a house where transcendental meditation and practicing forms of all kind of Eastern religions was the spiritual norm. And lots of friends of the family in my family were people who were well known actually in the early 90s in the sort of alternative religion sphere. I knew loads of these people, and I knew lots of their spiritual ideas, and I was really very close to those communities. It wasn't actually until friends brought me to a church in the mid-90s that I met people who I really had a tangible sense of peace from. One person called Alan stands out. I was 15 when I met him, and he was in his early 20s. Lots of ways very like me. He liked football, liked music. He was just loved messing around. But there was something about him that just had this incredible peace. I don't mean some sort of this kind of sort of super spiritual peace, but just a man who was deeply into God, into Jesus, and he just had this peace about him. He was at ease with his own shortcomings. He was the opposite of cool, but he didn't care. He knew God loved him. He knew that it was God who restored him to be the person who he was supposed to be, and he was as secure in himself as anyone I'd ever met. And he brought this peace with him as he went about the place. When you walk in the Spirit, and you find that God is your peace, and you become at peace at yourself and at peace at your community, we're called then to live as people of peace. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Romans 12:18 says, "As far as it depends on you, live as a person of peace." Because God has forgiven you when you were far from Him, you can extend forgiveness to those who've wronged you and hurt you. Because God is the one who avenges wrongdoing. You don't need to avenge evil. Receive the peace of God, the security of knowing Him, and live as a person of peace.